bit to cybervision, and then back.
That's a very interesting journey.
It's curious roots.
Super interesting.
The Feds are doing their counter-ransomware initiative today in DC. Have you seen it?
I have not seen what they are doing.
Direct competitor.
Well, the CRI?
Yeah.
No, the government. I think we're.
They fight us in private. IST's there today.
Yeah, no, exactly. But actually, we think the CRI, or we don't think, we know, CRI was formed out of the recommendations of the report. So
Sam
one of the top recommendations was
Sam Newberger's baby, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely, and I think it's necessary. What's not clear to me is how much they're still really committed, and so I'll look to see what comes out of it. I'd say I don't feel as connected to what's going on at the moment as I did. I need to get more connected back in. But the US team are working on that and are at the CRI event. So you were doing international at NTA. That must have some relevance to what you're doing now.
I mean, the only thing that's not international about most cyber investigations is data, or particularly me. Okay, but still something. Are we going to close the doors? Or? We can leave one open.
I can just take off this unless I just walk.
Ready.
Good afternoon. Thank you everyone for attending today's event. So this is a joint. Sorry, I've been told I need to speak more into the microphone. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending today's event. So this is a joint event between RUSI and the University of Kent. And it is on the back of or actually gives catalyst to a research project that we are involved in or that we're leading, funded by the NTSC and the Research Institute for Socio-Technical Cybersecurity. But particularly it is on this topic of ransomware and ransomware harms. Now, I completely didn't read my notes and I haven't even said what my name is. So if I sort of jump back a second, my name is Jason Nurse and I'm an associate professor in cybersecurity at the University of Kent. And I am co-leading the project with Jamie from RUSI. So the project is ransomware harms and the victim experience. And what we're particularly interested in is this question of ransomware. And we've seen lots actually mentioned about ransomware over the last years, but what we haven't seen actually is a focus very much on the victim and the impacts. We've seen a massive focus especially on the financial impacts of ransomware, but what we're especially interested in this project is what are the harms beyond the financial impacts? How are victims, be it organizations or individuals, impacted by ransomware? So that's actually the focus of the project, and that's what we'll actually be discussing today. So I hand over to Jamie, who will probably introduce himself and kick things off the right way. But thank you everyone for attending.
Thank you, Jason. My name is Jamie McColl. I'm a research fellow in the cybersecurity team here at RUSI. Just a couple of bits of housekeeping before we start the panel. I'm going to ask our panelists questions for about 40 minutes before turning to questions from guests in the room and online. If you're watching on Zoom, please put questions in the Q&A box, and I'll do my best to get to them. Finally, today's event is all on the record for the journalists in the room, of who I'm staring at directly now. So I'm going to introduce the panel. I'm going to start with Jen Ellis on my right. Jen will no doubt be familiar to anyone that's interested in ransomware, as she's been banging the drum on ransomware for several years now. She is co-chair of the Ransomware Task Force and spent 11 years bridging cybersecurity and public policy at the cybersecurity vendor Rapid7. She now works to advance cybersecurity and public safety through a range of board advisory and mentoring roles. She also tried to give me my start in cybersecurity when I was at university by offering me an all expenses paid trip to Black Hat in Las Vegas, which sounds quite dodgy now I say it. Sadly, I had to decline, so having her today for this discussion is a more than adequate replacement for that prize.
Good.
On my left, I have Eleanor Fairford, who is the Deputy Director of Incident Management at the NCSC. She joined the NCSC at its inception in 2016 and was initially responsible for leading cyber threat assessments for decision makers in UK government. Eleanor then took on leadership of the incident management function in 2020 and has led the NCSC's response to a number of nationally important cyber incidents, including ransomware attacks on critical infrastructure. Will Lyne, on my far right, is the head of intelligence at the National Crime Agency's Cybercrime Unit, leading a range of teams that lead, support and coordinate the law enforcement response to cybercrime in the UK. Will has worked in law enforcement for more than 12 years, and his brief has included counter-narcotics investigations in Afghanistan, a range of cybercrime investigations, and liaising with the FBI's cyber division in Washington, DC. On my far left, we have Joe Tidy. Joe is the BBC's first dedicated cyber reporter working on investigations in cybersecurity, and in his words, pretty much everything to do with the internet. Joe worked for Sky News as a generalist correspondent, but was drawn into covering cyber in 2014 when Xbox Live and PlayStation Network was hacked at Christmas time by a group called Lizard Squad. Joe's editor challenged him to find and interview a lizard, and Joe was forever fascinated by the world of cybersecurity. Last year, Joe went from tracking lizards to ransomware operators when he traveled to Russia to track down the Evil Corp ransomware group. Yeah, how did that go?
I failed. I got close. I got the leader's dad. That's as far as I got.
So Eleanor, I'm going to start with you as the NCSC annual review was published today, which I have in my hands. It described ransomware as an ever-present threat. How did ransomware go from a quite niche cybercrime problem to a national security threat in a relatively short period of time?
Sure, so thank you. So obviously we've been tracking the ransomware threat for the past few years in NCSC, and historically we always ranked cybercrime slightly as a kind of, second place behind the APT state threat actors that we were particularly concerned about. But it's become harder and harder to kind of relegate it to second place over the past few years, hasn't it? When you look at the extent of the impact of the sorts of attacks that we've seen against the UK and obviously globally as well. I think I would say that the problem for us is that a ransomware attack can have such far-reaching and damaging consequences that go beyond. They're not the sort of, it's not a targeted attempt to undermine critical infrastructure in the UK per se. It's an attempt to make money, and in so doing, sort of almost by accident or by second-order effect, can actually cripple significant infrastructure in the UK. So obviously, WannaCry back in 2016, on the face of it, looked like it was a financially motivated criminal act. Okay, turned out not to be latterly, but it was an example of a ransomware or a pseudo ransomware attack that could actually have taken out the NHS, and did for a period, didn't it? Could have resulted in a threat to life, to deaths. And then similarly, we've seen impacts on food services, food supply, JBS meat production in the US, Colonial Pipeline, of course, last year in the US as well, with gas supplies interrupted. So I think for me, the magnitude of the threat has become so apparent in the fact that what is a criminally motivated, financially motivated attack can actually significantly impact on services of critical importance to UK and other citizens. And that is where we have become really concerned about it in NCSC.
Great, thanks. And same question to you, Will. From a sort of investigator, from a cybercrime perspective, what's caused this problem to reach the point it has?
Yeah, it's really interesting how I think you're absolutely right. It has gone from quite a niche cybercrime problem. Many years ago, when this first started, you saw perhaps people's personal photos getting encrypted on people's personal devices at the time when malware was very much all about getting onto people's personal PCs as they would have been at the time and stealing someone's banking login credentials and then monetizing that. And actually the first kind of extortion schemes we saw were people locking or stealing people's personal photographs. And I think, point to two key things really. I think the advent of virtual currency is around 2010. Bitcoin came about in around 2010. And then what a lot of people describe as the online cybercriminal marketplace or the ecosystem. So you saw a lowering of the barrier of entry to get into cybercrime and to get into this type of activity. And then the proliferation of really significant high-end tools and capabilities within that ecosystem, combined with virtual currencies, which provide a very effective way for people to be able to move value from one jurisdiction to another. And it's quite cheap compared to we talked about getting onto people's personal machines. You have to cash that out with a fake card. Then you're going to have to try and get that money back to your jurisdiction. That was costing 60, 70, 80% of your profits by the time you realize them. But you can bring virtual currencies value back to the jurisdiction where you're residing really quickly and easily, and it's only going to cost you a couple of percent of that profit. So those things I think have combined, and I think the advent of Bitcoin in 2010, I think the first kind of ransomware schemes that we would recognize as a modern ransomware scheme probably came about in maybe 2013, 2014. So kind of crypto locker was for me, I think on the investigative side, that was the first ransomware scheme that I think I would really recognize as a modern ransomware variant. And it's evolved and developed, and ransomware as a service that is absolutely facilitated by that marketplace has led to this proliferation and has sent ransomware and pushed ransomware to be such an acute problem. And exactly as Eleanor's described, people getting onto networks of real national significance, often inadvertently quite indiscriminate targeting. People are just looking for a payout.
So Jen, you're a co-chair of the ransomware task force, which is one of several sort of public-private partnerships at this point trying to combat ransomware. And even today, the Counter Ransomware Initiative is meeting in Washington, DC. There's a lot of effort going into trying to deal with ransomware, but why do you think it's still such a problem?
Okay, thank you. As with anything in cybersecurity or cybercrime, the answer is not simple, and the solutions are also not simple, unfortunately. So there's a number of different factors, and I think you start coming out with a lot of cliches when you're answering questions like this. So cliche number one is that that attackers only have to get lucky once, whereas defenders have to be lucky every minute of every day, or good, if you prefer. They have to be, faultless, because otherwise you create opportunity. And the reality is the easiest opportunity for attackers is behavior, human behavior. It's very easy for them to predict how users will use technology, and it's easy for them to trick people, and so to find avenues in. And on top of that, software is complex, and so often it has vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities can be exploited. So there's a whole sort of system of issues that stack the odds in attackers' favor. And as Will said, it's super profitable. So, the opportunity exists for them. They're going to make a ton of money. Then we have the problem that we have countries that either can't prosecute or won't prosecute, that have a high level of technical infrastructure. So you have people who are in those countries, they have access to technology, and they have the skills. And often the skills don't have to be really, really skilled. If you're writing an email to trick somebody into taking an action, that actually doesn't require you to have fantastic technical hacking skills. There's a spectrum. Some people are using fantastic technical hacking skills. So it's sort of that combination of means, motive, and opportunity. I'm sorry, I sound like a really bad takeoff of somebody from the law enforcement world, which I'm definitely not. And it's a sort of perfect storm. And it's on top of that, it's really hard for companies to defend, right? Because solutions are expensive. The dialogue around them is complicated. Organizations have 1,000,001 other things to pay attention to, like inflation rates. And actually getting them to take action if they recognize that the threat is relevant to them, which often they don't, and to prioritize cybersecurity over the million and one other things blaring at them and calling for their attention, it's hard. So that's why it's still a big problem.
And Jen's just pointed to quite a big thing there, which I think this still persists, which is lack of awareness. Like, Eleanor, do you think you sort of been able to move the dial on that much over the last couple of years?
Well, obviously we've been trying. It's extremely prominent in our annual review, which I commend to you all. And Lindy Cameron frequently refers to it as the greatest cyber threat that we face. I would just come on to this, just go back to this really good question about like, why is it still so bad? And just looking at the way that the business model has evolved for ransomware, like it's really clever, isn't it? It sort of, it tracks what might otherwise be like a successful commercial enterprise, and it is, but it's just on the criminal side. And so initially we saw the sorts of encryption that Will was just describing, and then over the years, more in-depth reconnaissance, more targeted approaches, taking out the bits of your network that would really matter to you, and knowing where to target, lurking for some time before detonation of the ransomware itself. And then we've seen more recently, going after the data, looking for the data that's important, extorting it, exfiltrating it, and then conducting extortion, such that even if you do have great defenses, that data risk remains. So I'm kind of quite respectful of that growth curve that has been taken, and that sort of development of a business model, which is quite enviable. And I think, we're kind of behind the curve each time, trying to keep up, trying to mitigate it. But, the advances of the attackers are ever developing, and we're not yet there. And I can see it continuing to develop. The latest phenomenon that I'm really worried about is, so one of the sort of defenses that I'm quite glad about at the moment is that data leaks typically happen on weird recesses of the dark web, right? In like these cybercrime forums, and I'm constantly reassuring our sort of seniors that it's all right. It's not the same as like appearing on the front page of the Sun, right? Your data is going onto some weird sort of, little, it's not necessarily the same or quite as bad. But now I understand that the attackers are finding ways to put in like search engines, making it easy to find your data, whether it's been, put onto this random bit of the dark web or not. And you can download it more easily. They're making it more accessible and easier to weaponize and extort. And I fear that will become the next MO, and it won't just be in these dark parts of the dark web, and instead it will be more out there and be even more problematic as a result. I don't know if others on the panel agree with that, but that feels like a direction we could be going in.
I'd definitely say I totally agree. And these are really highly optimized and really adaptable profit-making enterprises. So you see the double extortion methodology, and we see now search engine optimization within the data leak. Triple extortion, whereby they're going after the customers who are part of the data that's been leaked. And now we see the quad or the quadruple extortion methodologies, where they're adding in kind of like DDoS type attacks and disruption at the same time. And yeah, well, I think we're just going to continue to see that trend. I really can't emphasize, or maybe we underestimate perhaps them at times as these very adaptable, really collaborative, highly optimized profit-making enterprises that they are.
It is possible to look at that as a positive though, because I'm thinking recently that why are they doing this? And it's because obviously they've got the resources and they've got the time, and they can put the effort in to try and maximize their return on investment, but they wouldn't do it. They wouldn't do it if they didn't have to. So right. It used to be the case that you hack and you cull the data and people pay, but they don't do that anymore. So now you have to find new ways. I like it. It makes them work harder.
Yeah. I actually think that's exactly on the money. No ransom pun intended. Because I think the goal with conversations about ransomware, if we're being completely honest, is not to eradicate ransomware, because that's just not realistic. The goal is to make it harder and more expensive for attackers to do what they do, right? It's to continually raise the bar so that they have to keep innovating and pushing and going in new directions. And it becomes a little bit less attractive than something else they might do. And so I actually think the fact that we do see these things evolving is a sign that we're sort of making some progress in that regard. I don't think we should all be patting ourselves on the back just yet, but there is hopefully some sign of progress.
You do have to be careful, though, I think. One way to think of it is imposing cost and risk to them and the business model. I think we as defenders and as the community also have to really think through kind of like any actions or interdictions that we might want to take, because you have to think those things through really well, just to make sure that you don't inadvertently make the problem worse or push the threat actors to what on paper might feel like a win for us, but actually is a higher harm technique or practice.
Are you saying that private sector hackback is a bad idea? For the record, it's a very, very, very bad idea.
I think one of the sort of big themes underpinning a lot of this is the professionalization of the ransomware ecosystem. Will, I'm going to put you on the spot a bit. You see reports from cryptocurrency tracing companies like Chainalysis, which demonstrate that they're sort of bringing in now hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars a year in ransom payments. Do you have any sense what the sort of operating budget is of a large ransomware as a service operation, and how that might compare to, say, a national crime agency operating budget for cybercrime? Because there's with all of this, there's a sense of a bit of a kind of arms race between attackers and defenders. And yes, we're forcing them to adapt, but they're still managing to.
It's a really difficult question. And I think what I would say is that I think the way that I've come to think about it, like relatively recently, and I'd be really interested in what other people on the panel think, is in, as power in that ecosystem has shifted to the affiliates, as ransomware as a service has become the prominent problem and the prominent issue, the groups and the named groups perhaps aren't groups in the way that we would think about traditional serious organized crime groups in lots of other threat types. Perhaps, it feels like it's a little bit more fluid, and actually you see affiliates, the power sits with the affiliates, the ones who hold the victims in that ecosystem, and they may use different ransomware schemes for different victims and things like that. So actually, I don't think they operate in a way that perhaps they might have done in the past, or in the way that other crime groups do. I don't think anymore that with ransomware there's a guy stroking a white cat at the top of the tree who's orchestrating everything and managing the budget and employing lots and lots of people to run a particular scheme. I don't think it works like that anymore, which is why I think it is so adaptable, because people can pull in the capabilities and skills they need within that ecosystem in a really dynamic way. So that's where you see not having discrete ransomware groups anymore. You see huge amounts of crossovers and rebrandings and all that type of stuff.
I think that's really interesting. I think the model has adapted now, doesn't it? So instead of a sort of one size fits all company that's having to cover off company group, that's having to cover off the kind of deployment, the choice of the target, and do it all in one place, it's kind of specialized into specialist areas, hasn't it? So those making the strains are now service providers, reach for affiliates to come and lease their kits from. And those with the actual criminal intent per se are much more, as you say, on the affiliate side, aren't they? They're the ones deciding where to target and using what kit as well. So it's almost like the sort of functionalities are split off into different parts of the ecosystem. And we probably do need to think about how to target it quite differently in light of that, don't we?
Yeah, you can't go at it in a way that you might have done a few years ago. And you have to think about it a little bit differently to have impact now, I think.
If I could just take it back to the harms point. Joe, we've already discussed at the start how ransomware is increasingly a threat to critical national infrastructure and essential services. You've done a lot of reporting on ransomware attacks against healthcare providers, education. What are some of the sort of second order effects of ransomware attacks that you've seen, say, on healthcare or universities?
Well, there was that one, I think it's still ongoing, the NHS cyber attack. Advanced, you'll know, is it still ongoing?
Largely within.
Right. Yeah, so that was an attack probably a few months ago now against Advanced, which runs lots of different web services and teleservices for the NHS. And it didn't get much press. And actually we sort of, at the BBC, didn't do much on it at the time. It was a very busy time. And I remember about 3 weeks after the attack, which we covered when it happened, someone from the health team said, "Oh, what's going on with that?" And I just completely forgotten it was happening because there's so many cyber attacks right now. But I got in touch with some people, and it occurred to me, and we wrote a piece about it, that this was a really big deal and it was affecting health services across the country. We spoke to one lady who runs the night care, I think, across Staffordshire, and she was saying that it's, it's pen and paper for 3 weeks, almost 4 weeks by the time we spoke to her. And she said to me that because they have to log everything down when they get the phone calls by pen and paper, it's going to take 6 months to get that backlog digitized back in the system once the system's up and running. And you get these little nuggets of information from ransomware attacks that really make you feel, okay, this isn't about ones and zeros and bottom lines. This is people's lives, and it has a big impact. And I spoke to a guy who runs a medium-sized station in Switzerland, and he was hit by the Reich ransomware crew in 2021. He said it's the worst 3 weeks of his life. He said it was absolutely horrible because they watch the screen. They do all of their sales through their website, and they've got pictures of all the products they sell, and one after the other, these pictures were just being encrypted and just disappearing and falling off the website. And he was just, head in hands, nothing they could do. And he had a big sort of town hall meeting, with 250 staff stood there. And he said to me that, yes, I was going to pay because all these people's jobs were at risk. A really horrendous time for him and the company. And he actually wrote a press release saying, sorry, the company's dead, Ofix is gone. And in the end, they managed to kind of get some funding and rebuild the systems and save the day. And it was sort of okay after many, many months and $500,000. But yeah, I think it's really hard to appreciate what it's like for people who get hit with ransomware, because we often do think about the companies as partly because of how hard it is to get information out, but you do get little nuggets sometimes of how bad things are.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I will share just two quick sort of anecdotes on this, because I think exactly as Joe just said, we focus a lot on the organization and not necessarily how it sort of filters through to the end of the line, the chain. So in 2021, people who've been listening to people talk about ransomware will know we had this month in which Colonial Pipeline was hit. A week later, HSE was hit, closing hospitals across Ireland, and 2 weeks later, JBS was hit. Just quick show of hands, how many people had heard of JBS before that attack? I had not. Okay, good. I'm not the only one who'd never heard of them. One of the biggest meat processing companies in the world. And I was talking to some colleagues in the States, and I made this joke about like, oh, this is what it takes for Americans to care about ransomware, is your gas on your chicken wings get impacted. And one of my colleagues turned around and said to me, obviously he didn't like that tone very much, fair enough. He turned around to me and he said, look, we have a problem where there are lots of families that live below the poverty line. And if you live below the poverty line, chicken wings are actually a staple. They are how you feed your family often. And if they go up 10 cents, which is what they had done, and this conversation was probably 2 months after the attack, and they were still 10 cents more, he was like, that's the difference between being able to feed your family and not being able to feed your family on a day if you are below the poverty line in this country. And that was a really humbling moment that made me realize that I was a word that I won't use since we're being televised. But it kind of brought it home to me that there is a really profound effect on this stuff. And then Joe ran a piece on the BBC where he had me and somebody else, I think another co-chair, were debating whether or not we should prohibit ransom payments. And this was in the wake of HSE, because HSE made the decision, since they are a government entity, that they would not pay the ransom. And so we had this thing, and we sort of went back and forth on it. And as things tend to do in the security community, it sort of spilled over into Twitter, and a lot of people from the security community got involved. Lots of people have strong opinions on this. And the view from a lot of people in the security community is that, people shouldn't pay. And some people will go further and say we should prohibit payment because then, it discourages ransomware attacks, and ultimately down the road, the problem will sort of evaporate. And somebody jumped into this Twitter conversation. I don't know who they are, but they were the parent of a child with cancer that was no longer receiving treatment in Ireland because hospitals up and down Ireland had closed. And they jumped into the conversation and basically said, firstly, they said, what the hell's wrong with you people? And then they said that they were in the process of trying to find out if they could remortgage their home to offer to pay part of the ransom. Because as a parent with a child with cancer, anything that they could do to help make sure their kid was getting what they needed, they would do. And again, it was that moment of realizing that we in security often sit in a bit of an ivory tower, honestly, and we talk about these things very academically and theoretically, and I'm not saying that it's a wrong thing to think that you shouldn't pay the payments, and that if you take away the profit stream, that eventually people will go find other things to do. But we have to remember that there are victims at the end of this chain, and that the impact of their lives can be super profound. And we have to not lose our empathy and our humanity around that stuff as we think about these things.
Do you think we still broadly think about ransomware as a victimless crime though? And I just think about what Joe said about there not being a huge amount of coverage, for instance, of the advanced healthcare ransomware attack, and that not necessarily being a lot of interest in that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that certainly trying to get a ransomware story on my news desk these days is very hard because they are so common, and it's a very removed, distant thing that happens to parts of the computer no one understands, which is why, me and other reporters in this room try hard to get those personal stories to bring it to life. Because until you do, I don't think people really care.
I do. I really agree. Just it's less the ransomware itself than the knock-on impacts that we're describing, right? And people's reaction to that. And the human factor, as we're hearing, it's really, really powerful. The ones that we've been involved with, which typically are the ones in the public sector, where of course we don't pay a ransom, I've always been struck by how powerfully it's felt by those who are the victims, but those who are so for instance, in local councils, where you've got people who are working to support vulnerable people in their services that they provide, and they can't do their jobs, they can't help their local community. And we had various testimonies, including at Cyber UK this year. And the testimony from Hackney, from when they went through it 18 months ago, 2 years ago, the people are still tearful when they talk about how they were unable to continue to do their jobs and to provide the services and look after their community in the way that they were used to doing. And I think it's that angle, obviously, that makes it more kind of newsworthy. And the other bit is the kind of really practical impact. So, for instance, in Hackney, the land registry searches were encrypted to the extent that it was the housing market in that area that was impacted, and house sales. So, if you want to get on the front pages, I'm imagining grinding to a halt the housing market in a certain area. That's the sort of thing that's going to attract attention, right? So, for me, it's those massive impacts, it's those kind of unintended kind of side effects that can come from what might otherwise be a pretty technical attack. That's where it becomes newsworthy, and also where we can get the attraction for it as well.
You can kind of break it down in two ways. There's the initial splash, the initial kind of victimization, and then for us, there's the long tail of so you're managing that crime in action, working really closely with Eleanor and the team at NCSC, but then there's managing the consequences, and that really is, that's quite often the real bulk of the effort for us. Yeah, really long tail, and that's where you really feel the impact.
Where does responsibility end for law enforcement and government in the long tail?
Really difficult to answer. I think it's it would depend on the nature of the incident, the nature of what it looks like, what data might have been exfilled, etc.
For me, a lot of this comes down to the fact that a lot of these attacks ultimately are often there's somebody's individual personal data at play, isn't it? So it's your health records, it's your patient data that you can't access, you know, or it's vulnerable people in the local community, or there was crime related stuff, wasn't there, relating to some of the, so you're talking about people's data that suddenly is out there, or you've got health related stuff, as Jen was saying, and that data suddenly acquires a value or a threat or a risk that can result in a public safety risk, can't it? Or it can result in other practical impacts. And for me, I think the next phase also that I am concerned about is where the cyber threat is rapidly kind of migrating basically into a data threat. And I know the Information Commissioner is all over this, but it's the data that is becoming the commodity that is at risk and then causing the consequence management, even in a world where we have sorted out potentially or made improvements on cyber defences and on the cyber side.
So I'd like to speak about why victims don't come forward next, because I think our inability to understand the sort of scale of the problem is clearly one of the threads running through this. Jen, what do you think is driving this?
I think that ultimately a lot of organizations fear a loss of customer trust. They fear reputational impact, and they fear regulatory response. And so there's a sort of view of, I want to just sweep it under the carpet and make it go away as quickly as possible. The reality is, you know, business leaders are really busy, and they've got a lot to deal with and to focus on. And really, they kind of want to make this problem go away and move on to the next set of problems as quickly as possible. And they don't really want to get penalized by the court of public opinion for something that they sort of view as being outside of their control. And we don't have a culture that I am aware of where we sort of publicly shame people for getting mugged, right? But there's a sort of weird stigma around the idea of a company being victim to a cyber attack. We sort of hold them accountable in some way. And okay, like there are things that people could do, but like there are also things you could do to avoid getting mugged probably. But we don't have that dialogue, right? We don't hold people accountable in that way. We're supportive of the fact that being mugged is a horrible experience. And we don't have that same attitude towards cyber attacks. And so as a business leader, you have this view that like your customers are going to lose confidence in you, and it's going to hurt your ability to do business. And there might be a regulatory agency that wants to come talk to you. The ICO might have something to say to you. And actually the figures from the ICO on where they've actually taken action, really low. And so we need to talk about that more openly and be really clear on what's really going on there. And so, yeah, I think there's a whole multitude of reasons.
Joe, have you noticed any change in the willingness of victims to speak to you as a journalist? Because okay. has it got worse or better?
It's just as hard as it's always been.
Okay.
Doing the job now for 4.5 years, and yeah, it's just as difficult to get people to open up and talk. There's a really annoying sort of set of euphemisms that we see in press releases that mean ransomware.
Yeah, they seem to be using every word other than ransomware
exactly,
to refer to ransomware.
So you can kind of tell when it is ransomware because of this set of words, which I think comes from, I don't know, law enforcement advice or insurers, that kind of thing. I actually disagree slightly with you, Jen, on the point of, I think quite often companies, rightly so, are a little bit ashamed of being attacked. Because I don't think it's the same as, because I've had this debate, heated debate with companies about my coverage. And my point is that it's not the same as someone leaving their house open or getting mugged, because the victims are not just them, they're the customers often. So they're custodians of data that isn't their own.
Absolutely.
So for that reason, I do personally hold a little bit more responsibility when I hear about a cyber attack.
Well, as to customers, right? Which is why they are afraid, why the companies are afraid.
Yeah. And I'm afraid to say sometimes when we do find out what happened, it's sometimes really embarrassing.
Sure.
reasons as to the attack. They are victims of crime, absolutely, and the criminals are bad, and we should never take their sides. But at the same time, I do think it is our job to scrutinise as well as report what's happened.
I agree. I'm not just sort of blanketly defending, but I do think that we have to recognize that actually the majority of companies sit below a point where they can spend a ton of money on security and building resilience, and they don't have the capability or the sophistication to do it. And so, you know, as you said, the criminals are the ones that are actually responsible. There can be opportunity provided for sure by companies not taking certain steps, but we have to actually recognize that that's the reality, like the reality of where we are today, because the complexities of the ecosystem and a million factors mean most companies are not going to be where they need to be on preparedness. We can either spend all of our time railing against that, or we can accept it and then talk about what the challenges are and how we start addressing them. But until we destigmatize the fact of being hacked, we will not have good open conversation with people about this.
And the funny thing is, when companies are transparent, often that leads to really good outcomes. Look at Norsk Hydro.
Yes, absolutely.
You know, from the start, they were very, like, they are the gold standard of how to handle a cyber attack. And they've come out of it all the stronger. And the head of PR, Halver, who's a hero, he travels the world doing talks about how they handled it and why speaking openly to your shareholders, customers and press is really important.
I just put a purely technical point of view, from the NCSC's perspective, obviously, we really wanted to see the transparency in order to learn the lessons, to know what happened, to conduct the investigation, and then to share those lessons across the sector. So from a purely sort of NCSC technical point of view, we want to be able to learn the learnings and then use it for further defence. And that's really, really important. And I'm concerned that the kind of the pressures that one faces in that immediate and when it first happens are such that you're not necessarily incentivized to find out what's happened. You just want to like pay and move on. And I think it is shown that those who do pay are more likely to be re-victimized. And of course, those who don't bother to find out how it happened in the first place haven't fixed whatever it was that allowed it to take place in the first place. So, I mean, transparency for the purposes of transparency, definitely, but also so that you know what happened and you can fix it and spread those lessons to the wider sector. So on a purely technical level, like getting to the bottom of it and finding out what went wrong is really important.
I totally agree with that. I think, you know, the norms around particularly ransomware attacks, because they've become so prevalent, become a bit skewed. I think if you're the victim of any other serious organized crime, you know, covering up and paying off the perpetrator and hoping to kind of get away with it, and then that person going and victimizing somebody down the road would be seen as really irresponsible victim behavior. Yeah. But it's something that, you know, it's a culture that has grown, and exactly as Eleanor says, you know, the more that we can understand it, the more that we can be more strategic and targeted in our interventions, and the more we can help protect other, I guess, future potential victims.
Eleanor, to what extent do you think government may have, and not just the UK government, may have contributed to this problem to some extent because of the languages it uses around paying ransoms? Particularly, you know, we don't condone, we almost condemn, and is that constructive?
So I do feel like on the operational side, and this is my personal view, I do feel like we're slightly painted ourselves into a bit of a corner, and Will and I have discussed this endlessly. When, you know, we're in the midst of supporting a victim organisation through an attack, and the senior steer, the political steer is, you know, go in really strong on why it's really, really bad to pay ransoms. You must not pay the ransom. We do not encourage, promote, or condone the payment of ransoms. And, you know, it's really, and then, you know, sometimes it's like, you know, ministers, well, I need to ring them up and shout at them for considering paying the ransom. It's like, can I just bring a note of realism here, right? You know, they're up against the wall. It's pay or go out of business often, or pay or lose your data. You know, the likelihood, sadly, the likelihood is that the choice to pay probably is going to reduce the risk of your data being leaked. And that is actually, you know, the business model is based on that trust regime. So the likelihood is that it is a step that one might reasonably take to attempt to safeguard that data. And I'm not suggesting that's what ought to happen. And clearly the strategic government perspective is every payment will lead to more ransomware, and therefore we must throttle it at source, and that has to be our line. But in the individual moment of the individual attack, that's not a helpful line to take to them, and it's not helpful to go in really strong. And what we do find is that all that happens is they stop engaging, they go underground. If a payment does happen, it's all done really covertly in this kind of slightly embarrassed, ashamed, stigmatized fashion that we're describing, which then reduces Will's chances to follow the money, our chances to investigate and to pursue, and ultimately to understand that other broader ecosystem. So we're cutting ourselves out of this other burgeoning ecosystem of like negotiation companies that negotiate with the cybercrime groups, right? And the groups themselves and what it looks like and how the Bitcoin transfers take place. Like if we're not part of that, we can't understand it and we can't start to address it either. So I do feel like getting that tone right around ransom payments is probably really important.
Yeah, it's a huge challenge. There's a very, really bad day for somebody that's been the victim of a ransomware attack, and there's just an enormous range of really complex factors and drivers that will drive their behavior in the way that they approach it, and it's really complex. It's really challenging. You don't want to condone, people paying perpetuates the problem. It makes it worse. But there's a real balance in it. Actually, ransomware is an existential threat in quite a lot of the time, and actually is paying the least harm option. Really complicated and really difficult decisions that people have to make. So, and a really delicate balance, isn't it? I think in government. How do we not make the problem worse, but how do we potentially encourage and foster better victim behavior? And it's really challenging and complex.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm going to turn to some questions from the audience now. I'm going to start online, but give everyone time in the audience a chance to think. So Alan Lisker from Record the Future has a question online. So with increasingly dire attacks on critical infrastructure, why aren't governments taking a more active response? And this is actually quite a strong question. Should countries consider drone strikes against ransomware groups? So, Will.
I love you.
Okay, so the drones have thrown me. Hang on.
You are not the drone specialist.
No, I don't have one of those, unfortunately. Absolutely. Ransomware is an enormous priority for us within the National Crime Agency, and there's a huge range of activity that we're undertaking with an array of partners across government, taking a kind of like cross-government, whole-government approach to the problem. We're really busy and active in this space. Obviously, understand it's difficult to talk about the specifics of what that is, but absolutely a priority for us, and a range of activity underway across government.
Drone strikes?
So I think maybe not drone strikes. I'm sorry, Alan, but I think that it is worth noting that there are initiatives that are going on that are sort of multiple governments coming together trying to figure out what to do. I think maybe you mentioned the Counter Ransomware Initiative earlier, which is meeting in the US at the moment. That's 30 different countries from around the world getting together, and they've got a number of work streams focusing on different potential avenues of activity, trying to figure out like exactly how to create this sort of cross-government response that will ultimately help push that needle forward, right? So I think yes, governments need to take a strong line on it, and they need to be really involved. I think also within governments, it needs to be a cross-government effort, and it needs to be a senior-led effort. I'm not sure the drone strikes will get us where we want to go, though.
I just on that excellent question, I was just going to point to the complexity of attribution, like being able to link it back to the right target in order to launch the drone strike, and just commend those efforts where we have managed to identify an individual. And I'm really sad that you didn't find the people behind Evil Core in person, but where we have, I do think there's been some quite successful sort of FBI indictments, right? And then there's like, is it Jakobets who's driving his Lamborghini around Moscow, right? We've been able to single them out and target them, and for me, and prevent them from traveling, crucially as well, right? So for me, these are the sorts of activities that might have a deterrence effect on those individuals if you can find out exactly who they are.
Joe, is he still driving his Lamborghini around?
Yeah, no, just say on the point, I agree with everything people are saying. I don't think we should do any drone strikes. I think that's a bad idea, which will make things worse. But I think high-profile arrests are key. Put people off. Sebastien Vachon of Netwalker recently found in Canada, arrested, and now behind bars, superb. And then make it harder for them to cash out seems to be the way. We've tried diplomacy with certain countries that are harboring these criminals. It doesn't work.
So if I'll come to questions in the room, Pia will have the microphone. Alex Martin, I'm going to start with you, the gentleman in the grey suit.
So much to all the panelists. Should I say it again? You will hear me.
We can hear you.
Okay. I could just shout like this, that's better. Don't worry about it, I can shout. Thank you very much to all the panelists. I'm going to ask this not as something that's a realistic question. I'm not asking for what's likely to happen, but what you would like to see happen. If you could bring forward one bit of government policy or bit of legislation to impact the ransomware threat facing the UK, what would that be and why? It does not have to be realistic, it just has to be a policy.
Who's it in?
I mean, who wants to come in?
I was just going to echo Joy's point about the money. I think if we, and I have zero understanding of how this all works, right? But if there was a way to prevent the cashing out through regulating the Bitcoin criminal marketplace by the know your customer regulations, etc., and literally preventing payments going through to those who are profiting from this, that would clearly be a way to throttle it and to cut off the flows of funding. And I'm sure there's more we could be doing in that space, so I would encourage that.
Jen?
Yeah, I mean, so yes, the thing that we've seen so far that seems to be having the most impact is the sanctions against specific exchanges, although that's a little bit of whack-a-mole. And as Ellen said, we already have regulation for cryptocurrency. We just don't have it applied very evenly around the world, which brings us back to the safe havens problem. And as Joe said, that's a really hard problem to solve. So I think that still needs to be worked on a little bit more. I would go to something that Eleanor and Will touched on, which is the lack of visibility. We have a problem where we actually don't know as much as we like to make it seem as though we know, because every security vendor out there will put out a nice report on ransomware using the data that they have from either the customers they're working with or the work that they're doing on the dark web, monitoring the dark web. And we don't even know how much those reports overlap each other in terms of data. And then we can get like a little bit of data from law enforcement if they're willing to share. And we can maybe get a little bit of, thank you. We can get maybe a little bit of data from cyber insurance, but if you look at the sort of market adoption for cyber insurance, it's still very low. So they've only got a small piece of the puzzle. And then we've got Chainalysis and other blockchain and crypto trackers. But again, the piece that they view is small because, ultimately cyber attackers want their wallets not to be tracked. That's kind of their goal. So we've created a sort of patchwork quilt of information by gluing all of these bits together. But the truth of the matter is we have no idea how much they overlap. We have no idea how much of the iceberg we can actually see. And so I guess the thing I would say is, incident reporting, much greater transparency around what's going on. Yeah, sorry.
But what I would say is that we've been looking at this problem for a long time now, both in the UK and with a range of international partners. I think if there was a legislative or a regulatory silver bullet to this, I think we would have stumbled upon it and dealt with it by now. So there is no regulatory or legislative route out of this problem, and there's pros and cons to regulation and new legislation as they come along.
I mean, presumably with the shift to data leak extortion, most incidents in the UK will be covered by the existing regulation anyway and should be reporting to the ICO.
Should. But yeah, it's a GDPR breach, yeah.
Great, so any other questions in the room? This gentleman in the front.
I think it's been very interesting. I'd just like to go back to Jen's point about cyber insurance, are we not caught in something of a systemic level problem here? That if we have insurance, there's simply no way the insurance industry can actually, at the rates they're charging, pay out if we have a major event. And what are we supposed to do when there is a large-scale supply chain attack? At the moment, the level of ransomware is very round numbers, about the same as from employee fraud, which we don't like, but we've learned to live with. But with supply chain attacks, we could have half the Windows boxes in the UK just stopping one day, and that would be like bad. So what do we do? Can we have an insurance system that actually works, but do we risk taking the insurance industry with it?
So yeah, I think the point you're making, fraud is not a new thing, right? And what the cyber element does is it just massively increases the scope and scale, and makes it into a problem that's now on a national economic level. From a cyber insurance point of view, you're exactly, of course, right. This is something that the cyber insurance industry has had a bit of a wake-up call to over the past 2 years. And they've, as a result, many of them have kind of got together and gone like, okay, let's look at whether we start to introduce better sort of norms, expectations of what cyber hygiene looks like, requirements for when you can claim, that kind of thing. I think the thing that we have to remember, insurance has done really amazing things in other sectors and has helped really move other sectors forward. And so there was this sort of view at the beginning of cyber insurance would be this great white hope, and it would kind of come in and solve some problem for us around cybersecurity. And the truth of the matter is, it's really nascent. And it's going to take a while for it to actually get where it needs to go. And it's going to take some really bumpy time for them to figure out what the right models are and what that all looks like. We have to remember that cybersecurity as an industry is very young, and cyber insurance is even younger.
This gentleman in the front here, please.
I actually have two very quick questions. One, to cyber insurance and hygiene. Let's say we wake up tomorrow and we have cyber essentials implemented everywhere. Is ransomware gone? It's now one question. And second one, because this is a problem and this is a crime, I'm wondering how close do you work with the law enforcement agencies of the countries where suspected criminals reside? Because otherwise you wouldn't be able to tackle it anyway.
Two very good questions. Eleanor, can I come to you on the cyber essentials question?
I think I'd be delighted if we wake up tomorrow and every organisation did implement cyber essentials fully. Would ransomware be gone? I think it would be largely addressed. There are times when you can have cyber essentials implemented, you can have the sort of policies in place, and you can have the right training delivered to your staff, but something still gets through. Somebody clicks on that link, or somebody left open a port they shouldn't have done. We saw one with an RDP in place that shouldn't have been in place, and it's left in testing. But a mistake, an oversight, very, very easily done, despite best efforts being in place and best practice. So these things will remain, but it would certainly take us an awfully long way, I think, if we could have those sorts of baselines in place. And just to pick up on the insurance point, if they could be a prerequisite to getting insured, that would be awesome to make insurance a force for good. And on the sort of systemic cyber events type point, I think for insurance, they're quite good at including exclusions as part of your policies. And I think the sort of scenario you've described would undoubtedly merit an exclusion. But I think I wanted one quick insurance point before we move on. Sorry. One other thing on insurance, my fear is that invariably your insurance these days includes cover for ransom payments. So if you are hit by a ransomware attack, and if your insurance is just going to pay the ransom for you, why wouldn't you go down that route? So I find that quite worrying too.
You see quite a lot of ransomware groups who are looking for insiders, and one of the prerequisites is they want your cyber insurance document as prerequisite for you to be an insider to then take a cut of the ransom that you're paying, and they know how much you're insured for, right? So funnily enough, the ransom then gets calibrated to that amount.
Well, fortunately, RUSI has a 50,000 word report out on the relationship between cyber insurance and ransomware in a couple of months. So hopefully we'll be able to answer some of those questions. What about law enforcement cooperation with say, law enforcement in Russia or Belarus or other parts of the former Soviet Union?
How's that going at the moment?
So we have a range of fantastic relationships with partners all over the world. And generally there are like-minded partners that kind of like see a lot of the same challenges as us and want the same things as us. Obviously it's a real challenge to engage with particular jurisdictions. I wouldn't necessarily see those challenges going away anytime soon, but what I would say is that there's a really strong collaboration and engagement with a range of partners. So not just really close working relationship with Five Eye partners, but actually, cyber counter ransomware initiative that Jen mentioned, 30 like-minded countries that are coming together where we're looking to agree common objectives and then deliver those as a community.
Great. I think we have a question in the polka dot dress.
Yeah.
I hope I've described that correctly.
It's a shirt, but not a dress.
Okay.
Thank you. Okay. So we've talked about the economic aspect of ransomware, but what does that mean? So we've talked about how do you disrupt the economic supply chain? Is it just doing some magical things with blockchain? What else? What are the other solutions that you can bring to the table? I don't know.
Well, if you look at how US law enforcement took down Revil, that's a brilliant example of sort of multi-pronged attack that you could use. Not only did they manage to get the Bitcoin wallets addresses of the ransomware crew, they also managed to take back some of the Bitcoin. I can't remember how much it was, 50 million or something insane like that. It was a lot of money.
It was from Colonial.
That was from Colonial, yeah. Well, we don't know where that particular bit of money came from. So I think, yeah, as well as sanctioning exchanges to make it harder for them to cash out, you can go directly after them. And I don't even know how they did it, but there is some magic wizardry that they can do, the NSA or whoever it was, to actually attack them, hit them where it really hurts. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, but that's a one-off operation. There isn't any kind of massive things that you can do with it.
I think it's the exchanges thing. I don't know, you guys will know more about this, but I think, yeah, the only thing you can do is overarching is go after the exchanges.
I think as we've, recurring thing that you've heard is that there's no one thing, right? It's lots of little tweaks here and there, which is why there are 48 recommendations in the Ransomware Task Force report. And I'm now going to tell you each one in turn. No, I'm not going to do that. We have to finish and we've got drinks. I think that other things that you can do is potentially look at ways of providing greater support and other options to victims. So, for example, if you could set up a fund for your most vulnerable, like your critical infrastructure and organizations for whom an attack really is existential and they have no other option. And you could say to them, hey, we'll provide a preferential loan. You have to pay it back, but it's preferential terms. And so that gives them an option so that they're not just like, I got to pay. And then you reduce the amount that people pay. And over time, that has an impact, right? There are things that you can do like that. Somebody talked about tax breaks for ransomware attacks and that kind of thing, but to encourage reporting, right? And so I think what you're trying to do always is find ways of shifting the calculus that people have so they're not just automatically paying. And one last thing that I'll say is just a plug for the No More Ransom project, which is www.nomoreransom.org. It is a fantastic collaboration between law enforcement around the world, including, I think, NCA, and then private sector entities in the security community to provide free decryption tools. So if you get hit by ransomware, your first stop should be nomoreransom.org because they might have a free tool for you. And so again, like, it's just trying to shift the dynamics around how you think about whether or not you have to pay.
I've thought about another way that law enforcement are going after the money. So with the mixing services on the dark web. So for example, Tornado Cash was recently sanctioned, and that's made it a lot harder for criminals using that service to mix their money up and then take it out without being traced. And then Hydra as well, which was a Russian darknet website marketplace, which was also sort of doubled up as a mixing service. So that's another way in which you you can attack the problem.
Great. We're going to have to wrap up there. Thank you to all the wonderful panelists today. There are 2 more RUSI cyber events in the next month. One on a meeting of Eastern and Central European cyber ambassadors, and later in the month, a conversation between Anne Neuberger and RUSI Distinguished Fellow Conrad Prince on information sharing. Thank you very much.